something about the spell that has been cast over too many Republicans in the House and the Senate. And so, Mr. Speaker, I urge the American people to save this Congress from themselves and restore the rule of law, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Speaker of the House, not the presiding officer at the moment, but the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, made some irresponsible remarks about climate change. He was asked about the reports that the President is prepared to act to protect the planet and future generations from climate change impacts. And here's what the Speaker had to say, quote, "I think this is absolutely crazy. Why would you want to increase the cost of energy and kill more American jobs at a time when the American people are still asking, where are the jobs? Clear enough?" End quote. Well, I could not disagree more strongly with Speaker Boehner. Presidential action to protect the climate and future generations is absolutely essential. The House is controlled by leaders who deny the science and are recklessly ignoring the risks of a rapidly changing climate. The House has become the last refuge of the Flat Earth Society. That is why the President must act using his existing authorities under the law. The Speaker's assertion that acting to reduce emissions will hurt the economy is absolutely wrong. We need to act to lead the world in the clean energy economy of the future. If we don't act, initiative, leadership, and economic growth will go to countries that do. Now, I've been in Congress for over 3 decades. I worked on the Clean Air Act, reauthorization of 1990. I remember the testimony we received in the 1980s about how if we tried to do more in the environmental area, we would lose our jobs and our economy would be set back. We would face another depression. Well, on a bipartisan basis, we adopted the Clean Air Act. We had the bill sponsored and signed by President George H.W. Bush. And that legislation led to accomplishments of reducing air pollution in some of our heavily polluted urban areas, including my own home of Los Angeles. We were able to stop the ravages of acid rain, which were causing destruction of our forests and rivers and ponds in the Northeast and in Canada. We were able to do something about toxic pollution, which were causing birth defects and cancer in large numbers of people who live near industrial facilities. And we were able to get legislation passed and move forward to stop the destruction of the upper ozone of our planet. We accomplished these goals because we didn't pay attention to the naysayers who told us our economy would be ruined, we would lose jobs, we should forget about a healthy environment, we should forget about pristine air in our national parks. Luckily, we had leadership from Republicans and Democrats to do something, and we can now talk about the great accomplishments that we achieved. And at the same time, we created more jobs. We created more industries. We created new technological developments. But let me talk about why the President needs to act on this question of climate change. On Monday, the International Energy Agency, IEA, released a report concluding that the world is not on track to meet the goal of limiting global average temperatures to below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees Celsius. Now, that is a tremendous concern because the scientists are telling us that if we don't achieve the goal of reducing the temperature rise, we are going to see some very severe impacts. Flooding of our coastal cities, increased risk to our food supply, unprecedented heat waves, exacerbated water scarcity in many regions, increased frequency of high-intensity tropical cyclones, irreversible loss of biodiversity, including coral reefs. Recognizing this danger, our country and other countries around the world joined together in 2010 and said, we've got to do what we can to keep the temperature rise below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The IEA concluded that the world is failing to meet this goal. Greenhouse gas emissions are driving climate change, and it's happening in an increasing rapidly. So can we just deny this is happening? Can we say, oh, we'll cost jobs and we shouldn't pay any attention to it? On our committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, which has jurisdiction over this whole question, the Democratic leaders on the committee have asked that we have hearings to bring in the scientists, because some of our Republican members have said they don't believe in the science. We sent over 36 letters asking that the scientists be brought before the committee to tell us why they think these terrible things may happen. And we have never gotten a response from a single letter of request for hearings. Can you imagine the people running the Congress denying the scientists and then refusing to hear from the scientists, or claiming the science is uncertain and not resolved, and then refusing to hear from scientists who could come in and talk about what they've learned? Now, if we're facing a world where all the accumulated greenhouse gases stay in that atmosphere, and to the point where our planet is heating up, and we're facing terrible consequences, you don't have to buy everything they say, but what are the chances that they're right? 10%? Would we take the risk that we're going to face a 10% chance of all these catastrophic consequences and do nothing about it? Well, that seems to be what the Republican leaders are saying, including the primary leader of the House, the Speaker. Now, let's look at some other more recent examples. When the President announced historic fuel economy standards, critics said cars would get smaller, more expensive, and it would hurt the sales of our automobiles. Well, they were completely wrong. Vehicle sales are booming. They are at high levels now. Consumers are saving money because cars are more fuel efficient. This is an accomplishment despite all the naysayers. When the Obama administration issued mercury standards for power plants and other sources, House Republicans said it would cost jobs and raise electricity prices. Well, that hasn't happened. Implementation has gone smoothly. Electricity prices have not gone up. In fact, wholesale prices actually went down, and there have been no rolling blackouts as predicted by the doomsday scenarios. In 2011, the EPA issued a report on the benefits of the Clean Air Act over the period from 1990 to 2020. According to the study, the direct benefits of the Clean Air Act in the form of cleaner air and a healthier population, more productive Americans, are estimated to reach nearly $2 trillion in the year 2020. We're talking about saving money by protecting our environment. So when the Speaker says that we shouldn't pay attention, it's crazy to pay attention to the concerns about climate change, he's absolutely wrong. When he says action to reduce carbon emissions will harm the economy, just the opposite will happen. We will create new clean air new clean energy businesses, and more economic growth. The President has said if Congress won't act, he must act, and he's absolutely right. The President must act, and he has the authority to act under existing laws. Congress will not act because the leadership of the House of Representatives denies reality. They want to politicize science. They want to politicize science by ignoring it. Well, science is not another political opinion. Science is looking at the evidence. Tune on the television news any day of the week, and you will hear stories about droughts and superstorms and new hurricanes and new climate events and new record levels of temperatures. Don't we think that something might be happening and that we have some responsibility in government to try to do something about this issue? Addressing climate change will require actions over the long term, but the IEA report highlights 4 policies that could be implemented now and through 2020 at no economic cost. Policies that will help reduce local air pollution and increase energy security. First, that report recommended that countries adopt specific energy efficiency measures. We don't have to build new power plants if we use our energy resources more efficiently. We could have more efficient heating and cooling systems in residential and commercial buildings, more efficient appliances and lighting in residential and commercial buildings. Energy efficiency measures can account for half of the emissions reductions that the report proposes through the year 2020. Secondly, the report said that if countries limit the construction and use of inefficient subcritical coal-fired power plants and switch instead to cleaner and more efficient plants, we will see the air get cleaner and the threat from climate change be dramatically reduced. Thirdly, the report recommended that countries reduce emissions of methane, a potent greenhouse gas from upstream oil and gas production, by installing readily available technologies in the short term and pursuing additional long-term reduction strategies. And fourth, the report proposed that countries accelerate the phase-out of fossil fuel subsidies, which exacerbate climate change by encouraging consumption of carbon pollution-emitting energy. Why are we subsidizing the oil companies with special tax breaks? Is a tax break for the oil company any different than an appropriation of dollars for the oil companies? They're doing very well on their own. What we need to do is to provide a level playing field for competition for renewable fuels and alternatives and efficiency. These are the things that we ought to be focusing on rather than keeping oil and coal the predominant sources of our energy for electricity and fueling our motor vehicles. Things are changing. They're changing because investors don't want to buy into stranded investments because they know climate change is happening. The American people are getting a clear sense that something is happening in the climate, but they don't hear Congress even talking about it. And around the world, others are moving forward. Why should we allow others, whether it's the Chinese, the Europeans, to develop the technologies? We have always been the leader in the developing technologies for the future. We developed the catalytic converter to control pollution from automobiles. We invented the scrubbers that could be used on power plants to reduce the emissions that come from these power plants. We have made all these advances over the years because we've given a clear incentive for anti-pollution control devices because we wanted to reduce pollution. And now we have a Congress where they want to deny at the highest levels of leadership in this Congress that climate change exists and the President shouldn't take any action. Imagine the top leader of the House of Representatives saying, I think it's absolutely crazy. Why would you want to increase the cost of energy and kill more American jobs at a time when the American people are still asking, where are their jobs? Well, the jobs can come along with efforts to reduce pollution. We have always seen the economy and our protection of the environment go hand in hand. We shouldn't say that we have to choose. We can have both. We have a long history of this country of bipartisan support for the proposition and the reality that we can preserve the environment and protect our economy and prosper if we are willing to adopt policies and show some leadership. Mr. Speaker, I remember when the compliance costs were being thought of when we were trying to deal with the acid rain problem. And industry after industry on the record, and it's all available to review, claimed the costs would be enormous. And then when we passed the law, the actual costs were a small fraction of what was being predicted. When they were told that they had to accomplish the goal under a cap-and-trade program to reduce sulfur emissions that were causing acid rain, we accomplished the goal at a fraction of the original estimates, which I think were highly inflated for scare purposes. But we accomplished the goal because we said, this is the goal. Accomplish that goal. You can benefit from new technologies and new ways to accomplish our environmental objectives. And that's exactly what we did when we dealt with the acid rain pollution problem. So my colleagues and Mr. Speaker, let's not have leaders who say we have to say that we're going to ignore the threat from climate change in order to protect jobs. We can protect and promote jobs and the protection of our environment at the same time. And Mr. President, you were so right when you said, if the Congress will not act, you must act, you must lead. And we are looking to the President to show that leadership, because we're not going to get it from this House of Representatives. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair lays before the House a message.
To the Congress of the United States, Section 202D of the National Emergencies Act provides for the automatic termination of a national emergency unless, within 90 days prior to the anniversary date of its declaration, the President publishes in the Federal Register and transmits to the Congress a notice stating that the emergency is to continue in effect beyond the anniversary date. In accordance with this provision, I have sent to the Federal Register for publication the enclosed notice stating that the emergency declared in Executive Order 13617 of June 25, 2012, with respect to the disposition of Russian highly enriched uranium is to continue in effect beyond June 25, 2013. The risk of nuclear proliferation created by the accumulation of a large volume of weapons-usable fissile material in the territory of the Russian Federation continues to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. Therefore, I have determined that it is necessary to continue the national emergency declared in Executive Order 13617 with respect to the disposition of Russian highly enriched uranium. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs and ordered printed. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we did vote on the Farm Bill, as it's been referred to, the Federal Agriculture Reform and Risk Management Act. But as some of us pointed out, and I attempted to establish through an amendment, this was not a farm bill. 80% was about food stamps. And it was a very brilliant move by members of Congress back when the Democrats controlled the majority, the 70s, the 80s. In fact, after Vietnam, the post-Watergate era, most liberal Congress until Speaker Pelosi took the gavel. And they did a brilliant thing. They were able to take so much in the form of welfare, public assistance of all kinds, and put it into so many different budgets under the jurisdiction of different committees, so that if at any one time someone went after one area where that was multiplicious, it was simply a duplication of other agencies, funds, then they could be marginalized and demeaned and had it said, well, you don't care about women or veterans or children or the poor or whatever. And it's worked well, in fact, to the point that we now obviously have about $17 trillion in debt, more than we've had revenue coming in. Basically, we would be perhaps Greece or Cyprus, other countries that are in bad, basically on the verge of bankruptcy, except that we produce our own money and the dollar is the international currency, so it's allowed all this reckless overspending. So I think it's time, and I know there are many others that agree, that we reform Congress to the point where all public assistance comes in one single committee, one area where all public assistance can be located, and it will be easy to see all the duplications, all the waste. So much easier to see areas where fraud is running rampant when you put all of those public assistance measures in the same bill. I'd actually proposed an amendment that would strike Title IV, which was the food stamp program, although it's been cleverly renamed the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, has a real snap to it. But the goal was not to do away with that program, and in fact, my friend across the aisle, Mr. McGovern, asked me, are you wanting to do away entirely with the food stamp or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program? And I replied before the Rules Committee, on the record, before a television camera, into a microphone, no, I didn't want to do away with that program, but I did feel it needed to have its own time, its own discussion, and not be 80% of a farm bill. But what is really heartbreaking is not that children are not going to have food in America, because whether we bring a farm bill back that separates out the food stamp program so we can deal with that separately, not do away with it, but deal with it separately, or whether it comes back and we're into the rut of just continuing to extend and extend, children will not be allowed to go hungry. But I think back about the presidential campaign last year and about how much the politics around here has degenerated such that when a Republican like Mitt Romney or John McCain back in '08 says, you know, I disagree with my friend, my opponent, but I know he's a good man and he has a good heart. He wants to do good things for the country. We just disagree on how to get there. And yet what we have coming back, as Mitt Romney saw, was Mitt Romney, after saying he's a good man, good family man, but I think he's wrong on these issues, what came back from the drones, the human drones that were speaking on behalf of the president was, gee, he wants to push people off a cliff. He wants people to die of cancer. He wants them to get cancer. He's obviously painted as a very evil man. And that came back to mind today during some of the discussions. I heard our friend from Maryland, Minority Whip here, talking about the Farm Bill, blaming Republicans for not being bipartisan, when, you know, 3/4 of the Republicans had voted for the Farm Bill, and yet our friends across the aisle did make it a very partisan measure, and not only made it partisan in the rhetoric condemning Republicans for not reaching out, things were said in the subsequent discussions. My friend from Texas had been here on the House floor. But comments from friends across the aisle like children were crying out here for food, and Republicans, in essence, not only voted down their help, but wanted to slap them down. I would never say that about a friend across the aisle. I think they're wrong in the way they want to bankrupt or they want to spend so much more money than we have coming in. It's bankrupting the country. But I would never think for a moment that one of my friends from across the aisle wanted to slap down children. I just wouldn't bring myself to say that, because I know it's not true. I think they're very wrong-headed on so many issues. But comments like, you know, taking not only food, but their utensils or table and just leave them with the floor. How could we do such a thing? And yet, when we look at the food stamp bill that had 20% farm in it, that did not pass today, it certainly wasn't for a lack of work by the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, Frank Lucas. Chairman Lucas and I don't always agree on things, but I know that man. He is a good man, and I did appreciate hearing Mr. Hoyer commenting as much. Frank Lucas worked very, very hard on this bill, and he actually got reforms in here. And there were actually amendments passed that some didn't like, but it was a bipartisan bill. There were some Democrats that voted for this bill. That makes it bipartisan. Not like Obamacare that was rammed down the throats of America and the Republicans without having input, without having the any opportunity for amendment, really, just forced upon Republicans in the country. And in fact, there's never been a Congress that has been as close to amendment, as close to input from the other side as we witnessed when the Democrats took the majority in January of 2007 until they lost the majority in November of 2010. Those years saw more closed rules, no amendments possible. It was unbelievable the way our friends across the aisle were so abusive with the process and preventing almost half of the country from having any voice in anything that went on. So when I hear our friends across the aisle talk about a lack of partisanship, it's a little difficult. And what really is a bit heartbreaking is to hear people across the aisle speak so eloquently. And as I sat here listening today, hear people speak with such incredibly persuasive words and expressions and with such venom and passion that if I did not know the truth, I actually would be believing how horrible and evil and nasty and child-hating Republicans really are. However, I know the people on this side of the aisle as well. And there's not anybody that has been elected to Congress. There's no other way to get to the House. There's nobody that's been elected on either side of the aisle that wants to see a child suffer because of anything we do. And it is very offensive to have people on one side of the aisle attribute those kinds of feelings that we wanted to hurt children. Really? And it sounds so real and so true. How can we ever have legitimate debate in this House of Representatives when anybody can stand and attribute such evil motivation on the side of the other and make it sound so real? Do we have any chance of saving this country when people can come to the floor and make such ridiculous allegations sound so persuasive and true? You can't have debate like that. On the other hand, I have looked in the eyes of constituents of mine as I go all over my district, down in a wonderful little community of Broadus, just recently for a town hall. I go all over the district. One of the things that really makes me proud is to be introduced as having been to some community more than any other member of Congress. They thought, oh, well, he was from Tyler, he wouldn't care about the area. I care about the whole district. And I know all of the people that are elected, they do care about their districts. But when I look into the eyes of constituents who want to provide for their children, they want them to have the best that they can provide for them. And they talk about standing in line. I've heard this story so many times from people who are brokenhearted about it and sometimes get angry just thinking about what they've seen and what they've heard. But standing in line at a grocery store behind people with a food stamp card, and they look in their basket, as one individual said, I love crab legs. Snow king, you know, the big king crab legs. I love those. But we haven't been able to have them at our house, and who knows when. But I'm standing behind a guy that has those in his basket, and I'm looking longingly like, when can I ever make enough again where our family can have something like that, and then sees the food stamp card pulled out and provided. He looks at the king crab legs and looks at his ground meat and realizes because he does pay income tax, he doesn't get more back than he pays in. He is actually helping pay for the king crab legs when he can't pay for them for himself. And people across the aisle want to condemn anyone who is working and scraping and can't save any money and is trying to decide how in the world do we ever get ahead, can we ever get ahead. You know, they're cutting back my hours at work. We're doing the best we can, and yet I stand in line and see multiple people paying with food stamp cards for things I cannot afford. How can you begrudge somebody who feels that way? How can you begrudge anyone who steps up on behalf of constituents who feel that way. We don't want anyone to go hungry. And from the amount of obesity in this country, by people we're told do not have enough to eat, it does seem like we could have a debate about this issue without allegations about wanting to slap down or starve children. Because when I think of children, I think about those also who are growing up right now. They have no say in the amount of money we're spending in this chamber right here. Billions and billions and billions with so much waste, fraud, and abuse. And yet those very little children who have no voice in what we're doing are going to have to pay for our extravagance and our waste and our fraud and abuse. What kind of parent would want that? I don't know of anybody on either side of the aisle that want that, but it is what we are producing. And I didn't vote for the Farm Bill because it's not a farm bill, and I believe we need to have a debate where we bring all the public assistance into one place so we see what's there, and we can cut out as much waste, fraud, and abuse as possible, where we can make those cuts. Because when we're spending the billions and billions and billions we are for food supplement, whatever you want to call it, and there's story after story of people who are caught selling interest in their food stamp card or what they buy with their food stamp card. Can we really not come and have a discussion about how we can quit putting a heavier and heavier burden on children that have no voice in this Congress? Can we not have a debate and discussion without demonizing people that say, look, I care about the children that are growing up and that are going to be born, who shouldn't have to pay for the extravagance and the narcissism within this generation? Can't we have that discussion without demonizing one another? I would hope that we can get to that point. One comment about Tea Party extremism killing the Farm Bill. When a small reform is made to the food stamp program, and this additional requirement is added that for those who are able to work, they will need to work. Is that evil and mean and just so totally in disregard of those who are getting from everyone else? You know, we heard this when Congress wasn't a blip on my radar, but we heard this over and over as Newt Gingrich and the new Republican majority, after 40 years or so, came into this body as the majority, and they said, we are going to reform welfare. And they did. And President Clinton didn't want it. He fought it tooth and nail, but just like the balanced budgets, he fought it, he fought it. He uses his veto more than once. But finally is signed into law when it's clear to President Clinton that there are votes here in a bipartisan way to override his veto. He might as well sign it. And now today, how wonderful it is when he extols the virtues of his 2 terms as president, the virtues of what the Republican majority did when they finally reined things in. Now, I was told as a freshman, don't even bother to go, as a very staunch conservative, don't even bother to go to the Harvard orientation for new members of Congress because it's just so liberal. They, vilify those of us who think like we do, that we need to be more conservative in our spending. But I went anyway. enjoy a good debate, and we had several. But I was struck, even at the liberal Harvard Law School, where they've totally forgotten the reason for their founding and what was required of students in those early days as they prepared them to live a life in total submission to their Savior, Jesus Christ. It's amazing when you go back and read the things that the students were taught and what they had to take an oath to believe. But there at Harvard, we had a dean come in with charts who explained, ever since the Great Society legislation in the 60s, I know some think maybe born out of less than noble ideas, but I believe they were born out of the best of intentions. They saw people needing help, so let's give them money, let's give them help. Gee, there were deadbeat dads around the country, so let's give the single moms a check for every child they have out of wedlock. And back then, when there was between 6 and 7% single moms struggling to get by, over the years we have paid for more and more children out of wedlock, and as philosophers have said, you pay for some activity, you're going to get more of that activity. And now, in this country, we are getting what we've paid for. We're past 40% single moms, on our way to 50%. I think in large part because this Congress decided, well-intentioned, to try to help single moms, and instead of trying to help them reach their God-given potential, maybe help them with daycare, get back in high school, finish high school. You can earn so much more if you finish high school than if you never do. Get a little college and you'll make more. That's what the statistics tell us. If we care about the people, why wouldn't we want to push them? And these charts from this dean at Harvard showed that since the Great Society legislation, single moms' income, when adjusted for inflation, for about 30 years was a flat line. Single moms never, on average, did not improve their situations. And along came what was portrayed as being these evil Republican congressmen and senators who said, we're going to reform welfare. We're going to require people that can to work. And they pushed people out of being on the dole of the federal government and pushed them into starting to pursue their God-given potential and what they could do for themselves and to feel good about themselves because they're providing for themselves. And he pulled out a chart to show single mothers' income when adjusted for inflation after welfare reform, when people were forced to work that could. And wow, for the first time in about 30 years, single moms' income went up when adjusted for inflation. So who cared more? Those who said you Republicans are evil for trying to make people work who are getting child support from the government or getting welfare, how evil you are. Are they in the more virtuous position? Or those who say, I know this will work, I know every human being has potential that God put there, and we want them to move toward that. We do not want to pay them to be a couch potato and to pay them to keep having children out of wedlock and to pay them for not pursuing what they're capable of pursuing for themselves and that wonderful feeling when you accomplish something for yourself. Who is more virtuous in that situation? Well, I can tell you from the rhetoric, my friends on the Democratic side were the virtuous ones, and the Republicans were the evil, mean-spirited, self-involved people because they wanted single moms to reach their potential and make more money, and it happened just like that. So then President Obama comes in, and what does he do? Right off the bat, he wants to eliminate the work requirement. I think he was motivated out of good intentions, but we're back to where we were. We want people who have been getting food stamps, if they can work, then work. Let's push people toward reaching their potential. That's not evil. That's a good thing. And people are free to worship whoever, whatever, or no one if they wish in America. But for those who say, well, gee, you're a Christian, the Christian thing is to give people money if they need it. Well, in Romans 13, it talks about the government is supposed to be an encourager of good conduct. An encourager, it would seem, to reach your potential, not to kill your potential, to encourage people to reach for the stars, not kill a NASA program and force people to teach to a test. If we want to keep having a country that is worthy of from so many places around the world trying any way they can to get in this country, then we must protect this country. That's what our oath involves. Protect the country so it's not overwhelmed. Prevent this country from becoming one massive welfare state. But encourage the greatness in people. And we're not going to help that when we see a leader of a country like Syria, an Assad, who has killed so many people, who we would not want to support to stay in that position, but he's being challenged by people who we know are involved with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda type groups, and who want to subjugate other Muslims and Christians, or kill Coptic Christians, as we've seen in some places, kill others, Jews, Christians with whom they disagree. Do we really want to help either one of those? You know, those back before they had to teach to the test, people learned a little bit about history. And they had to learn about World War I. And you don't find enough people that can talk intelligently about World War I anymore. You know, in fact, we see the polls that say there are more people that can name the Three Stooges than can name the three branches of government. Because the test they've been teaching to involves a federal, everyone has the same kind of requirements, when we were doing better when there were local requirements. The local people knew best. But back when people were learning history, they found out, and we were tested on and taught, that World War I came about because of what we were told were entangling alliances. What do we see around Syria? Well, Iran is propping up Assad. Russia says we're going to send in the best anti-aircraft defense if you start a no-fly zone there. And yet this president, without the support of Congress, just like he did not have when he went into Libya, and we know how that's turned out, at least 4 people are dead that wouldn't be otherwise, but he's giving money to Syria, really? $1 billion? What I was reading today, how about taking that $1 billion that's going to cause all kinds of death and that will probably in some way someday end up causing the deaths of Americans and Israelis, allies of ours, Coptic Christians, Jewish friends around. They're going to kill people who were never intended because it's not well enough thought out of this administration rushing into Syria. Well, we didn't rush in, that's for sure. Perhaps if the president had decided early on to go in, then it wouldn't have been so massive an al-Qaeda movement within the rebels. But we know they're there. This is not the thing to do, to get involved in a country where the United States national interests will not be served if Assad stays in power, and they will not be served if the al-Qaeda rebels take over. So why are we spending $1 billion? Why are we sending help to either side in that scenario? Let's help people at home. Let's use that money to secure our borders. Because when it comes to immigration, if we really want to care, it's time to secure the borders So legal people coming in, do so legally, and then we'll get an immigration bill passed in no time flat. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I would move that we do now hereby.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 11 a.m. on Monday, June 24, 2013.
So the House has gavelled out, but earlier today members failed to pass the Farm Bill after working on the measure the last 2 days. That legislation would have set policies over 5 years for farm subsidies, crop insurance, and nutrition programs. It failed by a vote of 195 to 234. And right after that, House leaders Eric Cantor and Steny Hoyer came to the floor to discuss the legislation as well as next week's schedule. Here's a look.